Welcome to Coffee with Cade. I am super excited to be here with you, and I have the pleasure of inviting my dear friend, Mrs. Meryl Rosenberg, who is a fertility lawyer and really a contract lawyer with expertise in fertility, which is so important. And she's also the CEO and president of ART Parenting, a firm based in Rockville, Maryland, that provides support to those who are looking to work with a gestational carrier or a known donor egg or a known egg donor. Or I'm sure Meryl can do a much better job, and I apologize if I butchered that too much, but she's fabulous. She's really fabulous, and she's a lawyer, and she has done a lot both locally and nationally to help improve legislation and opportunities for families with infertility. So Meryl, thank you for being here.
It's my pleasure. I'm happy to always speak with you and educate people who are going through any assisted reproductive technology needs.
Awesome. And so I want to first say that we have some folks from both Facebook and Instagram that are joining us right now. And if you actually have any questions that you'd like to ask while we're on the air, feel free to just send them to Meryl or send them to the Cade Foundation's Facebook or Instagram account, and we will respond to them live on the air. So let's go ahead and get started. Again, I am talking with the attorney extraordinaire, Mrs. Meryl Rosenberg, who is the founder, CEO, and president of ART Parenting, a firm that provides support to individuals and families who have fertility-related legal needs. Although I'll say, I think everyone benefits from having their own lawyer who can explain things, explain the contracts that they're given, and in particular, the fertility contracts that you're given by the clinic, which every single person has to sign before most clinics will work with you. So Meryl, welcome.
Thank you.
So can you tell me a little bit about, I introduced you, but tell me a little bit about everything that you do, because you are so much more than just a lawyer. You're an incredible woman, incredible mom, but tell me a little bit more about what you do in the field of reproductive endocrinology. And again, thank you for everyone who's just joined us. I'm super glad to have you. Please send in they've already started sending in questions. So as soon as I'm going to go ahead and read that question. Please go ahead.
Okay, so the first thing, well, it would take many, many days to probably answer your first question, but suffice it to say that I do run a full program helping people who need gestational carriers, helping to find them and seeing them through the whole process. One of the more important things for sure, or one of the few things we look at, is one, making sure they're working with a gestational carrier from what we call surrogacy friendly state where it's legal. The other thing is making sure every step of the way, intended parents and those that are helping them, whether that's donor, sperm donor, egg donor, embryo donor, are executing the legal documents they need to execute. One thing that you did mention is contracts with the fertility centers. Actually, what they're doing is they're signing consent forms for treatment. And so there's a difference between a consent form, consent document, and a contract. Oftentimes, the people conflate those things, and it is helpful for anyone really undergoing fertility treatment to have a consultation with an attorney that understands the process. Most people don't, but most of those consent forms state on them that they've had an opportunity to have a conversation with an attorney about what it is they're signing. So it really is important to educate yourself about what it is you're signing, what are those consents, and what do they mean, and why are they different than a contract, especially in a donor situation or a surrogacy situation. I see somebody asked a question. Do you want me to answer that question?
Yes, please. So the question for those who are on Instagram who may not be able to see it as clearly is, are there any laws that I should be aware of when using egg donation? I think, Meryl, please.
Sure. Yes, the answer is absolutely. In any egg donor arrangement, whether it's anonymous, and we'll talk about what that means, or a known donor situation, the best practices is to have a contract between the donor and the recipient or recipients, because in that way, the parties to that process are entering into a voluntary consensual arrangement for that donation. Again, when they each sign consent forms with the fertility center, those consent forms are consent to treatment by the fertility center. It's not really an agreement between the parties. And there are different donor laws in different states, just like any parentage is addressed state by state.
Mm-hmm.
Anything with respect to surrogacy or donation is different state by state. So that's another reason why it's a good idea to have a consultation with an attorney who can explain to you your rights and expectations and parentage and who's a parent.
So Meryl, I've got so many questions and I want to dig that out a little bit more. So we talked about meeting with a lawyer who knows fertility and knows the law per state. Where can people find information about these lawyers? Because I would imagine it'd be difficult to just go online and Google fertility lawyer or lawyer.
Well, you do have to be, you definitely want to do your due diligence. You can certainly, if you're already working with a fertility center, they can give you a few referrals to speak with, to reach out to. There are a couple of actually a few places people reach out to. One is called the Academy of Adoption and Assisted Reproductive Technology Attorneys. I know that's a mouthful, but that's a vetted organization of those of us in the field who practice in this field in the different states, so that can be a resource. Also, the American Bar Association has a family law and ART committee. Resolve is an organization that's an advocacy organization that also people reach out to when looking for all sorts of information around infertility, including how to reach out to an attorney qualified in the field. Just like anything else, when you go through, any particular, whether you need a will or if you're doing, real estate, any area of specialty, you want to work with an attorney that knows this area of the law.
Okay, so I just read AARTA and the American Bar Association are two organizations where anyone can go to find out about local lawyers who are familiar with fertility law.
Right, and to also ask the doctor they're working with. Many fertility practices have attorneys that they work with. They're not associated with the IVF center, but they have referral sources where they've worked with certain attorneys for many years. They know that the attorneys they're referring to are experienced in the field. So that's a great resource.
Okay, that's great. And so can you talk a little bit about the differences in the law in the different states? So I know that you and I are both based in the DMV area, which is Maryland, Maryland, Virginia, and Washington, D.C. They kind of group all of those states and those regions into one area. Can you talk a little bit about the differences in law between those three regions? And I think that would be an example of how the law would differ throughout the country.
Sure. It's not a bad question in terms of the differences. So some states, and these days more states than there were even a few years ago, actually have statutes, have laws on the books that address third-party reproduction, whether it's gestational carrier cases or traditional surrogacy. So with a gestational carrier, there's no genetic tie to the person carrying the baby. With traditional surrogacy, the person who's carrying the baby is also the genetic provider for the egg in that case. We see that less often these days than we used to. That's a whole nother topic, I think. And also there are different statutory schemes for egg donors or sperm donors or embryo donors. So some states like DC, we have a brand new law. It took many years to get passed. That passed within the last couple of years. That does actually address how to go about the process when you're working with a third party helping you have a child, whether it's a donor or a gestational carrier or even a traditional surrogate, which is unusual. Many of the laws around the country don't address traditional surrogacy. In Virginia, there's also a law that's been on the books for many, many years, very different than the DC law, but it does address that a donor is not a parent. It does address how to go about surrogacy if you're working with a gestational carrier. In Maryland, we actually don't have a statute, but we do have legal cases, legal precedent that assists in the practice in terms of understanding what's legal and what's not legal, and also practice for many, many years in terms of how third parties looked at in a friendly way, in a positive way. So that just in gestational carrier cases, what happens in a traditional surrogacy case, and egg donors as well.
Wow. Okay. So
I don't know if it's what you wanted or you want more.
no, but I think that really demonstrates how in areas that are very close from a geographic standpoint, the laws they can differ.
And by the way, it also might make a difference whether you're married or not, whether you're a same-sex couple or a heterosexual couple or not, and how that's dealt with. And it's dealt with differently between Virginia and if you look at that layered against DC and Maryland as well, and around the country, we see varying laws, which is why it's so important to speak to an attorney in the state or states that are part of your arrangement.
I think that a lot of our federal workers kind of fall within a loophole because many of them don't live in the District of Columbia. They live in Virginia and in Maryland. And so they would fall under at least for insurance coverage, the requirements are different in those three states. So some may have outside insurance that would cover versus if they get their insurance through their employer, the government, they may not be eligible for coverage.
Right, but it's also another reason why it's so complicated and why it's very hard to tease out yourself. You would never be able to, I wouldn't think, is there are different considerations for insurance as opposed to where is your contract based and can it be Maryland, DC, or Virginia, and it will depend on lots of different considerations. It's not just residency based of, where you are. Something might be tied to where the IVF is taking place. Something might be tied to where the donor is located. There are different considerations in terms of what laws will apply or can apply in your case, and that's different from insurance.
Okay, that's really, really good. So, all right, let's move on. We do have a question. We had a question in closed adoptions, and I know that your work is primarily with infertility and reproductive endocrinology, but you are a lawyer, and I know that you know a lot about many different topics. So in closed adoptions, records are sealed. In embryo donation or gestational carrier situations, do the children born as a result have the right to records regarding their parentage? Great question.
That is a great question. And one of the things I do advise people, there's different kinds of donations. And there's anonymous donations and known donations. There's different levels of known donations. Some people, especially through donor agencies, are able to meet their donor, but don't really know how to reach them. One thing I really stress is in this day and age, there really is no such thing anymore as an anonymous donation. With 23andMe or Ancestry.com or all these ways that people are able to find out more about their DNA and their genetic history, the more people are able to find information and make connections that people didn't intend necessarily. Even now when people enter anonymous arrangements, I tell people no one can guarantee that anonymity into the future anymore. So I think that that's one of those things that's important to keep in mind. It's not a right to. Medical records are private. They're protected under different laws, including HIPAA. Records in court are usually sealed around surrogacy cases in particular. I mean, if you're going through an embryo donation or egg or sperm donation, and the person who's the intended parent is carrying that child, you're not going to have a case that's going to be sealed in court. in most circumstances. But at the same time, children and people are finding out more and more about their genetic history. So it's something to keep in mind. There is also something called the donor sibling registry. It is voluntary. It's not mandatory. I don't know what the future is going to bring. So that's why when you're planning now, you have to keep in mind the changes we may see into the future.
I just kind of following up on that, I just read a story recently about someone who had a donor sperm. And it was an anonymous donor, but when the person got conceived and they decided they wanted information about the donor. And so they went on 23andMe and got some information and then kind of attempted to
reach out
to the person. And I don't think that he was really open to that. But I completely agree with what you're saying. And I don't know, did you have any thoughts about that?
No, I mean, that's what I'm trying to convey is, especially as a lawyer, one of the primary goals of entering into a contract is having that conversation about intent. Yeah. And that is what the contract is all about, is the intent of the parties and making sure that intent is memorialized in a legal document. And especially in this field, we try to have all the parties think about what the future might bring and what the what ifs are and how to protect the parties into the future. But we also have to be realistic. And in this day and age, there is no such thing as absolute anonymity. Now, what happens at the end of the day, it's hard to say. So that's a perfect example. And that comes up a lot. That's not the only case we've heard about that. And we've heard of other cases where people are finding out information that is, turning their world upside down because it's not what they expected. And trying to connect. And the layers are complicated, I think, thinking about the future. And people really just have to keep in mind, all the studies in terms of donor conceived children, if you will, indicate openness and talk about openness and how important it is to educate your child from an early time about the fact that they were conceived using a donor for many different reasons, for their medical history, but also the data has shown over time that is recommended for a lot of different reasons, including for sure that people are finding out these things that they didn't know about themselves later on in life.
Right. So, wow. So that's a lot to consider. So I know that when I was in medical school, we used to get these little invitations in our mailboxes to become an egg donor or for the men to become sperm donors. And back then it's totally anonymous. You can just do it and make some money and it'll be helping people out. But I guess we're seeing now that, that's not necessarily the case. So you need to be prepared to be identified.
Right. And I think that's part of the education. I mean, there is a component to American Society of Reproductive Medicine issues guidelines around all of this. That's changing all the time. And, there are a lot of guidelines out there that guide those of us in the field. And one of the components is a mental health screening and or education, psychoeducation, making sure the parties are all considering every step of the way when they enter into this arrangement, whether it's the donor, whether it's the surrogate, whether it's the intended parent.
And how is that changing now when there are organizations, for instance, thinking about like Donor Egg Bank USA, where you don't actually have any interaction. The donor doesn't necessarily have any interaction with the family that ends up receiving. It may be years between when they actually donate the eggs and then they're used.
Well, I think we've learned a lot, certainly from years and years and years of the sperm freezing and sperm banks. It's certainly harder to donate your eggs than it is to donate sperm. But in terms of the education around it and the mental health screening around it and what the donors are being told in terms of contact and future contact and what to expect, that shouldn't be different. It should be the same as it is for sperm donors as well as for egg donors. And hopefully the education is really looking at that in terms of when the donor is going through that process so that they understand what a promise of anonymity may or may not mean.
Doesn't seem like it means much at this point.
That's the point. I think nobody can guarantee it anymore. We just can't.
Right. So, Meryl, I want to kind of loop back because we are running low on time, and I want to make sure that we get any questions answered. So if you all have any burning questions, please send it in right now because we are almost finished with this interview. But Meryl, I really do believe that every family that is going through any sort of fertility support or treatment, or even just trying to a diagnosis, I really do feel like every single family would benefit from a lawyer who knows fertility law and a mental health provider who has worked with families with infertility. Can you tell me a little bit, in your opinion, about the benefits? I know that we've talked about that before, but just kind of a summary why this is important. And maybe you don't agree. Maybe.
No, I happen to agree. And I think, this is really about me being an advocate for people going through IVF. And not just because, I work in third party. I think in general, when you walk in the door for treatment, your goal is to have a baby. That's your goal. That's what you're focused on. And I don't think that you're necessarily processing everything you're looking at and reading. There's so many documents you have to sign to move forward with the IVF treatment, decide which treatment. Perhaps you're looking at different financial packages. There's so much being thrown at you. And when you get to those consent forms and those documents, it's really important that you understand what is it that you're signing and making sure, first of all, that the consent forms and the documents fit your situation.
Yeah.
Not every case is the same. It's definitely not one size fits all. So you have to make sure it fits your situation. And if it doesn't, speak up and say something. The other thing is you have to be really thoughtful. You're being asked also about disposition of eggs and or sperm and or embryos. And you're not really thinking about that, including what happens if you happen to be a married couple. There are going to be questions about what if there's a separation or divorce. And there are questions, what happens if both of you die? What happens if one of you dies during treatment? And you're not thinking about those things. So sometimes you're just quickly checking off the boxes.
Right.
And it could result someday in that's being utilized to look at what your intent was, what you wanted. So it gives you an opportunity to take a step back and really thoughtfully read those documents, understand what your rights are, what is it you're addressing, and what you should think about in executing those documents. And by the way, it also makes you think of things like, what about your will? And when you're doing estate planning, is there something in there about guardianship, about children born or unborn? Is there something in there about what if you have frozen embryos somewhere or gametes somewhere, meaning eggs or sperm? So there's a lot that you have to think about when you're signing those documents, when all you are thinking about and want to think about is how to have that baby.
Absolutely. Oh my goodness. I think you just hit the nail on the head. When you are going through fertility treatment, sometimes you can just be so desperate to bring home that baby that you will sign anything, you will agree to anything. You won't even think about it. And then down the road, those things that you signed, that you agreed to, that you didn't really understand may become way more relevant and important. So know your rights, know what you're signing, understand those forms, and work with someone who knows what they're doing. And that's not to say that, any lawyer that you might find in the phone book is not a good person or that they don't know a lot, but it's been my experience that people who do a certain thing more often are just they're better at it. And so when you're working with a fertility lawyer and someone who really focuses their practice on fertility law, my belief is that you're probably going to get a little bit more information and more tailored information to what you're dealing with than if you deal with more of a generalist. Am I correct with that, Meryl?
I think you, as you just said, hit the nail on the head. And it won't take a lot of time, by the way. If you're working with somebody who knows, in terms of the consent forms and review of that piece, I'm not the whole process, but in terms of that.
And can you talk really briefly, I think we're finishing up right now, but how much does it cost to work with a fertility lawyer?
Well, it depends on what your needs are. That's something that varies between fertility specialists, but if it's, a review of consent forms together and understanding that piece, it shouldn't take someone who knows what they're doing more than an hour of their time, maybe an hour and a half of their time. If you need a contract for an egg donation or a sperm donation or an embryo donation, certainly that's going to take a little bit more time than reviewing consent forms. And in terms of the gestational carrier contract and arrangement, that's going to take probably even more time than that. So I'm not trying to, it really varies. And you know what? It doesn't cost you anything to ask those questions of a qualified infertility attorney, to see what fits your needs. But really, in terms of protecting yourself for the rest of your life and the rest of your lives, I know it's an expensive process for sure. Anyway, IVF is, but that added protection, it's everything.
Well, thank you so much, Meryl. This was quick, but my goodness, I felt like I could have stayed here and continued to ask you more, and we could have chatted for the next 30 minutes. I think we have one last question. Oh, we have a comment. Education on all of this is so helpful. There's so much to think about when you just can't think about it all on your own. Thank you for this education. So good. Okay, so thank you, Meryl. I appreciate you for spending this time with me and with everyone who is spending their lunch break or their lunch hour time chatting with us. So this is Coffee with Cade, a conversation, not a presentation. And it is hosted by the Cade Foundation 2 Mondays out of every month, usually the first and the third Monday of the month. And our guest today was Attorney Meryl Rosenberg, who is the senior lawyer and the president of ART Parenting out of, I said Rockville earlier. Is it Potomac?
Right next to each other. Like this whole area, it's the same.
Okay. So she's in Maryland, but Meryl, are you licensed in other states other than Maryland?
Also in DC and New Jersey.
Okay.
And I'm retired from Michigan.
Okay, very good. So if you're in any of those states and you need a very qualified and very competent lawyer to speak with about your fertility needs, please consider Meryl and ART Parenting. So before we finish, this is Coffee with Cade, and I'm going to raise my Coffee with Cade cup. Meryl, what's in your cup?
What is in my cup is coffee, black coffee.
No sugar, no cream, just to get okay. And my cup is actually empty, but I was drinking water all day long. So I'm super happy to be able to share with you. Meryl, if you just hold on for one moment, and to those of you who joined us, thank you. Have a wonderful afternoon, and we'll see you next time.